There we go. Good morning still to everyone. Morning. So I've got the pleasure to try and tell you how to work with building design in a very short time. And that's a really complex thing. So I'm going to try my best to give you an understanding and a perspective from building design and how we should appropriately do building design for airborne infection. So there's a lot of slides, but those slides are also for your own reference and perspective. And also when we do the workshop afterwards, you'll be able to apply that. So, and there's a couple of nice images, so let's see how we go. So what I want to speak about is firstly IPC in the built environment, and then some factors that impact IPC in the built environment. We're going to just use primary healthcare or primary healthcare center as a basis to understand or unpack flow and the way we should be understanding them. And then just what evidence design is out there, or evidence-based design as an approach to solutions. And then I'm going to show some salutogenic design examples, because salutogenics really picks up a lot of the elements that we are speaking about when we speak about healthy environments. And then just some perspective on MOBI, which is built environment or microbiology of the built environment, and really what it is and why we are affecting space, and then how we get into the workshop. So I always put this up because this very rapidly brings context to where we're at. So these are a couple of random numbers that I'm going to throw out there, but those numbers actually all have value. The first one is the average life expectancy if you're living in Africa specifically. Of that 65 years you're going to be living here, 86% of the time you're going to be spending in indoor environments. Whether it's in your house, whether it's in this space right now, or any other indoor environment. Of that, most of you will be spending majority of that at your home. And then you'll be sleeping a lot of that away. Yes, so even your bedroom is important. And there's a number of studies on that. And then depending on how outdoorsy you are, you're only going to spend about 8% of that time in the outdoor environment. So suddenly that makes that 86% extremely, extremely important. So every environment, every space we're in, whether it's a healthcare environment, whether it's the mall, whether it's anywhere, they become important. They become important because of the rapid rate of urbanization. Africa, for example, over the next 30 years will increase by 300 million people in urban centers. So what that means for increased rates and concerns of new and emerging diseases, or emerging diseases, new diseases, we can only venture on. So it makes really important sense to understand how we deal with these spaces, all spaces of indoor environments. So when we look at buildings and health, I'm sort of going to just put this out there. In the past, one of the first studies was Florence Nightingale's understanding of what happened in the Crimean War, and her perspective on what was the real big problem during that war when most people died. And it was not because they brought something in, it was because they got ill from being in that space, overcrowdedness. And today we sort of understand this a bit better. And we understand that through this perspective of nosocomial infection or healthcare acquired infection, and we have a better understanding of what are all these factors that influence that. As we know, HAI is prevalent worldwide. It's in public spaces and public shared environments. I think COVID has bring a lot of what we in the TBN field know needs to happen. I think COVID has sort of brought that to light to the rest of the world. And I think there's a wave that we need to jump on, and hopefully we haven't missed it, to actually make a massive impact in the TB sphere, as opposed to this wave moving where everyone was more conscious of how to deal with social distancing, how to better understand a cleaner space, whether it's air, whether it's anything else. So if we don't bring that back, I think we are going to sort of have to go repeat ourselves again. Unfortunately, history is not in our favor because it repeats itself. It goes cyclical. I'm not going to go through this slide. A number of my slides I'm specifically using so to give you perspective as where the built environment fits in. And so this slide solely shows the routes of transmission, but what is critically important is the elements of where the built environment is critical in this process. So from the causative agent through to the reservoir, through to the mode of transfer, And then also, again, acceptable host, meaning how many of us are in those spaces. And every single one of those key points is the built environment and how we're managing that. Number of routes of transmission, all again linked to my material choices, flow, layouts of spaces. It links to how many touch surfaces, how do I touch surfaces, how do I enter spaces, how do I leave spaces. Airborne, Toby has spoken a lot about that just now in ventilation. He managed to actually say quite a lot in a really short time, so I'm quite impressed. But just to give you an idea of what are the different diseases linked to each of those different forms or routes of transmission. So let's go to a bit more. So again, Toby spoke with the probability of infection, but again, what I'm going to take out of this is only the elements that relate to the built environment. So the idea of dose, number of people, in other words, sites of contact, what is the space like, how long am I in this space, and then the receptive host, and then the form combining community of those people in the space. Again, all the bits and pieces of the built environment is fused in that, which is why we have to be concerned about these healthcare environments, and more particularly, and I'm going to venture into a sensitive topic, more particularly our healthcare workers, because they are there all the time. You guys are all the time in those spaces. Yes, your patients come and go. They're there for 3 hours, 4 hours, depending on what the reason is for being there. And we need to consider them, obviously. However, your healthcare worker is there continuously. And Toby sort of explained how much air they would need to keep that space safe. It's a lot. So we need to design it safe from the start, as opposed to retrofitting and trying to fix it, which never and very rarely happens effectively. I'm not going to get into the R0 numbers, but really we can have a better understanding of what we're trying to deal with, how we're trying to manage and resolve potential risk in certain environments, if we know what the specific disease type is that's either prominent. South Africa, we know what the prominent disease types are, or the new emerging ones, or if there is a disease that is potentially flaring up and we have to try and deal with it. So we can relate that and link that back. Again, why this is important, we all know this, we've all seen this, so I'm not going to jump into the detail, but this is really important from a ventilation and space design perspective. And I'm going to speak about a case study a little bit later where we actually found the shift or the proportional mixing of bad air, infected air throughout two hospital facilities when we try to understand the microbiome of a building and how that became really evident. So we ended up with this slide, and I'm putting the slide in there as an early point, but it's purely for those 3 points. It needs to be a basket approach. So I can speak about building design, and yes, that's the underlying thing. Let's get the design right. That's quite easy. We can approve it. We can go through the system. We can understand what we need. We can get all the interdisciplinary team involved right up front. I'm saying this very blasé, but the reality is often that team has no IPC coordinator in, or the IPC coordinator's voice is really soft, and no one listens. But the reality, that person has a really big responsibility. That TB coordinator has a really big responsibility in the design process, even from the start. And if we get that right, we change how the building's outcome. We have less retrofitment and fixing. So what's really important is that it's a basket solution. It's not just ventilation. It's not just respiratory solutions. It's not just administrative SOPs, policies, all those things. It's not just that. It's how we combine all of those parts together. Within the field of architecture, we often speak about different building programs. And a strong building program is one that actually has a very strong layer of administrative on top of it. Where a weaker program is one it's designed in a certain way, and I use it exactly that same way. We actually regard that as a weaker program, where a stronger program can be used in an interplay between both, and it allows for more use and more flexibility at the same time as managing it. But there within lies a IPC gap. So when we look at hierarchy, as I was speaking about now, it's administrative, PP, and then obviously your environmental controls. And within that, we fit in the ventilation design principles, key critical design principles, UVGI, planning and program. So just to hang on this point for a second, these are the key short quick prospective solutions when we think about contact and airborne spread from a design point of view. And the first one always is avoidance and design out. And how do I avoid the problem from happening? How do I design it out? And that can be done through either separation, it can be done through seclusion, or it can be done through isolation, depending on what it is that you want to do. I've been to many facilities and often they say, oh, this is a fantastic isolation room. And really it's just two walls that are separating one space from the next. So our understanding of what isolation is has an impact of what we are providing as safe environments. Exactly the same with GUV. If it's just a blue light, but I'm actually not doing the testing and I'm actually not seeing that it is emitting at the right irradiance and still doing it, then it has no value. The risk is high. It's exactly the same. Then systems proofing and people proofing. So from a sustainability point of view, it's critically important that we understand this. There is a difference between systems proofing and people proofing. So systems proofing is saying, is facing the fact that we have Eskom and we need to deal with it. That is systems proofing. So how am I going to deal with that? What am I going to put in place? Well, let's go one step back. What is the hierarchy of decision within applying a ventilation solution? Noting that I might not have electricity to run the HVAC system. So what am I going to do from a design perspective right up front before I even start the process? And that has an immediate impact. So that's systems proofing it. And that's not just with electricity, that's speaking about water, that's speaking about number of staff, it's speaking about all those elements. And then people proofing, that's designing so that we can't make changes to systems. So if I'm going to put a switch right behind a nurse's station, and yes, winter it is cold, so often they put the HVAC systems off because it's cold. But what they don't know is the system that's sitting behind it. The moment that system is switched off, there is no ventilation. So how do I people proof it? I don't put a switch there. Okay. Building materials, airborne. Depending on the material choice and the application needs to be appropriate. I'm not going to fit out a hospital environment or a healthcare environment with the same finishes as this room, for example, and the same kind of ceilings as this room, for example. So the appropriate material choices and the appropriate spaces is critically important. And then obviously when we look at different surface materials, using the appropriate surface materials for its value. So if I'm using copper and all the copper and other nanotechnologies and the appropriate use of that, it also has to be appropriate in my context and environment. I'd like the copper there to be there tomorrow and the day after. If I go to Chile, for example, in Santiago Airport, many of the columns are in fact cladded with copper. Why? Because they're high touch surfaces and they're public spaces. All right, and copper deactivates certain organisms. So there is value in what they've done, and also they happen to be the copper belt of the entire South America. So that sort of changes the picture. And then what's really important is workflow. And the workflow speaks to spatial sequencing and configuration. I'm going to jump into that in a little bit more detail. Toby touched on the whole idea of ventilation, and ventilation is not just what I'm providing and how I'm conditioning the air if I'm looking from an HVAC point of view, but it has a lot of other elements, and that's the whole idea of thermal comfort linked to it. And thermal comfort has a multi-layered sub-elements, one of them being social and physical or psychological factors, and that's different for each of us. So, which is why, again, the default back to natural ventilation makes a lot of sense, because I feel more comfortable in a space I can't control. Because it is what it is. I can bring a jersey, I can bring a jacket, I can bring a blanket to change that environment to my requirement, to my need. Whereas if it's a specific set environment at a set controlled temperature, I have to tend to fall in with that, and I'm expecting it to be controlled. So all of these elements in this pie actually ties together to the appropriate ventilation solution, and not just the air. From a ventilation hierarchy design point of view, we need to look at it firstly starting at full passive, then moving our way systematically up the chain towards full mechanical, where that's sort of the last option. The reason why I'm picking on different things from ventilation to flow to materials is because this is the suite of the building design. The building designer, the team, actually needs to consider all of these things, not just one, not just two or three or four. It's a collective decision. in the end, all of this needs to be considered with reduction in occupancy levels, needs to be considered within segregation, within ventilation solutions. And then only can I start choosing or designing the appropriate layout for the appropriate solution in those appropriate environments to be appropriate for the healthcare service provider. This image we've used a lot. Who can tell me what is wrong with this image? There's no windows. And what do you think is the service of this facility? Let's take a wild guess. It's a clinic. So but there's ventilation. Not really. Toby will kill me if I tell any of you that that's ventilation. No, so there's some space, some dirty air being cooled inside there. So that's a problem. And that's not just in this building, this is many other buildings out there. So when we retrofit spaces, reuse it for other purposes. Even retrofit our facilities, healthcare facilities, using one room for another purpose, but not understanding that it fits in with the collective of all the rooms. So if I'm just going to change the function of that one space, it's not that simple. It has an impact. So from a design guide, and again, this goes back to design and planning. I'm just going to quickly put these on there. These are the different options, whether you're going cross ventilation, single-sided ventilation, non-single-sided, we've got a broken passage in between. It gets progressively worse, and you get less and less ventilation. So from a design point of view, these are the factors you need to consider whether you are going to go for natural ventilation or not. And I can't, for example, use the last option in the bottom right corner for you, bottom right corner, yes. And then so I've got a naturally ventilated building and believe that it's going to effectively work. Then I want to see a section of it. A section meaning I'm cutting through the building like this. And I want to understand how that air is moving in and how that air is moving out. And if it actually is working. Most likely this will have a 2.8 ceiling, typical standard windows, or like we saw just now, no windows. So from the clinic, well, it's complicated. That's what our buildings are. They're complicated, they're not simple. The core function of a primary healthcare is to provide services and include outpatient clinics. And a person may be admitted to uncomplicated inpatient care, which may require at least one overnight stay, potentially, for maternity services. So suddenly the design challenges become a lot more complex. So I'm just going to unpack a few of these things, and then we add all the services that are there, and suddenly we've got all the diversity of users. And when I have a diversity of users, I then have a diversity of functional spaces. And then I have a diversity of how do I meet these functional spaces? How do I lay them out? How do I manage and deal with each of these functional spaces? And then I have to give a risk rating to these functional spaces. And then eventually I've got to, then only can I consider what is the right design solution or design approach. So some design principles that needs to be applied with that in mind is access and circulation. Who gets to go where and who does not? Do I go in a circle or do I move in and out at another point? Obviously now security comes as a second point of consideration. Do I backtrack on the flow? So people go into my facility, they go into the waiting area, they go into main reception, then they go through to the next point, go to vitals, then they go into the consulting space, and then they go to pharmacy, and then they walk past everyone else, and this person was undiagnosed with TB. And now he's rerouted all the way back. Could I design that differently? Absolutely. Okay. Then there's factors like security. How do I consider security within that complicated concept? Infection control should be underlining all of these elements. That's one thing I've been advocating for many years, is that unless we have IPC as the underlying principle behind every one of these: access, circulation, security, inclusive environments, ergonomics, we will keep having the same problems. We'll keep returning to the same issue. And then patient satisfaction, privacy, dignity, and respect. Obviously, that's critical. How do I deal with that in these spaces? Which means, how do I provide a safe space for someone at the same time as when I close the door that I don't restrict ventilation? And then inclusive environments, I'm not going to get into that, ergonomics, and then obviously ventilation. Primary healthcare, this is just an overview. I'm just going to skim over these slides. I'm sure I've got almost no time left. But this will give you an idea of public, private, who's restricted, who's not, what is the access, what is the flow, acute admissions, all the different admission points, and somewhere all of these people come together. And when they come together, then we have to consider interdepartmental layouts, flow diagrams, density diagrams. So what I'm trying to say is, if you haven't seen any of these things, when someone has given you a design, we have a problem. Because they needed to consider these different diagrams and these different approaches. So we all are advocates. At some place or another, you are involved in some kind of design outcome solution. And you need to be asking for these kind of guidance documents that the designers, whether it be a mechanical engineer, civil engineer, architect, so someone coordinating the process, have thought about. If they haven't, we have a problem. But now you know, so now we won't have any problems. So then primary healthcare centers specifically, just giving you a better understanding of the relationships. These images come from the IUSs, which is previously drafted by the CSIR, my former employer. If you go onto the website that we've created, it's the wiki, we've actually uploaded a lot of these documents there. So you can actually go and grab those documents, including the dedicated TB infrastructure services document as well for designing TB facilities. And then when we speak about zoning, this is a better understanding of who goes where, what is the restriction of levels, what are the different zones that we need to think about as we move through these places. From an evidence design point of view, what's really important is when I take it to the basic principle, there is a lot of information out there. A lot. In particular, on healthcare environments. And we have no reason to keep designing the same thing over and over and making the same mistake. Or giving the same guidance that are incorrect over and over, because there's a lot of evidence that's been written up, published, that we just need to go and use and reapply more appropriately. So we can measure the impact of the physical design on its user, because it's been done. We just now need to take that information and apply it. Good starting point, and I'm not a reviewer for them, but if you go to the HER journal as an example, they've got a lot of guidance, specifically just on healthcare worldwide. And it's a nice collective of work. These are just some nice examples of, and I've used this as a salutogenic examples, but these are examples of well-resolved planning. Yes, every plan has a problem, but well-resolved planning, considering the principles that I've spoken about, and then applying it. And yes, these are public health facilities in the Western Cape. This one is another one. This is Hermana CDC as an example. But this is what we can do in our public health environments. It's possible with the same budgets. And we can consider all these factors and we can manage it. We just have to be purposeful and do it. What is critical and what should be the precursor if I'm doing any alterations, any changes to existing buildings, are risk assessments. And I don't have nearly enough time to even get into that. But risk assessments is critical, because then only can I understand what is the need and what is the risk requirements within these spaces. And if I should make design changes, how do I do that after I've got an understanding of what the risk is? This I've thrown in there because this is really what our spaces look like. We just don't see it. This is where you are right now, but this is painted very nicely and we don't see this. All right, so this is when we understand a building, and we need to understand a building from this point of view, that a building is like us. It's like a human being. We've got water and blood and all kinds of things moving, and the moment I cut one off, we all know what happens. The building is exactly the same. Building is a system. So we need to look at buildings as systems, as a systemic approach. So if the system is not working, then the building fails. I can't just move to another room and think it's going to work. It won't. So we need to understand buildings from a systemic point of view. In the case study that I specifically said earlier, where we try to understand what was the biome of two healthcare facilities. What we did understand from that was that ventilation is one of the key drivers, yes. In this specific building, we had some rooms that had open windows, and we had rooms that were completely enclosed. and they had pretty much exactly the same ventilation biome, or not ventilation biome. They had exactly the same communities in each of those spaces, distribution. So that says that when we connect these systems, we are moving the same environments through all our spaces. Even if we think some of the environments are healthier because they've got open windows. So the last point is what's important is that building design revealed a new layer of infection and IPC, a complexity in the built environment. So a stronger program, in fact, presents a more temporal and dynamic microbial community. Okay, in other words, if I'm using it exactly the way it's designed versus physical spaces, and if I actually plan it differently. I've added these last few slides. I'm not going to speak about them. This is what we're going to be doing afterwards. I've got some plans at the back there. We're going to actually review that, and we're going to work through that and do some exercises and see how you can apply some of the concept that I've spoken about, so that you can go back to your facilities at your directorates and be able to apply some of these concepts. And we're going to use some fictional site, and we're going to critically analyze and look at that. But we will discuss that in a bit more detail a bit later. So, thank you.